Early years. Helen sat by the window of her cozy living room, the warm afternoon sunlight casting a golden glow on her frail hands. She leaned back gently in her rocking chair, letting her thoughts drift back to a time decades ago, back to the wide expanses of rural Texas where her story began. Born in the early 20th century, Helen grew up in a small farming community in central Texas. Her childhood was shaped by long, endless days under the vast Texan sky, where the horizon seemed to stretch on forever. The rolling fields of wheat and corn were her playground, and the symphony of cicadas was the background music of her youth. It was a humble life, defined by long hours of work and simple pleasures, but it was one rooted deeply in the values of resilience and grit. Life on the farm was anything but easy. Helen, the youngest of 5 siblings, quickly learned that every pair of hands had a role to play. Day after day, she rose before sunrise to help her father tend to the fields. The mornings were brisk, and she could still remember the chill of the dew-drenched grass soaking through her shoes as she walked to the chicken coops to collect fresh eggs. Her mother, donned in a simple cotton dress and an apron dusted with flour, would be in the kitchen baking bread or boiling coffee. "Hard work builds character," her father would often say, wiping the sweat from his brow as he guided the plow behind their aging mule. Even as a child, Helen understood the gravity of his words. The scorching Texan sun spared no one and the labor was grueling, but her father's tone was never one of complaint. It was steady, almost proud, as if he saw beauty in the challenges of the land he called home. School was a luxury back then, and Helen attended a small one-room schoolhouse a few miles from the farm. She'd pack her books and lunch, often a simple peanut butter sandwich and an apple, in a burlap bag and walk the dusty trail with her siblings. The school itself was modest, with creaky wooden floors and a chalkboard that always seemed to be coated in a haze of white dust. Her favorite subjects were reading and geography. She'd lose herself in stories of faraway places, imagining what it might feel like to escape the small-town routines, to see the bustling streets of New York City or the snow-covered peaks of the Rockies. Despite the daily grind, her childhood was not devoid of joy. Helen had a knack for finding adventures in the simplest moments. She'd climb the old oak tree behind their barn, its sturdy limbs giving her a secret perch above the world. Her best friend Mary Lou, who lived on a neighboring farm, would often join her, the two of them giggling as they traded secrets or planned imaginary journeys to distant lands. On warm summer evenings, they'd chase fireflies across the open fields, or sit around a bonfire, listening to her father play the fiddle while neighbors clapped along. Still, life in Texas during Helen's youth wasn't without hardship. The land could be unforgiving, and many years brought droughts that left their crops parched and their livestock thin. She vividly remembered the Dust Bowl years, when dry winds turned their once fertile soil into suffocating clouds of dust that invaded every corner of their home. The family would seal their windows with damp cloths, but the fine grit always found its way inside. Many neighbors packed up and left, heading west to California in search of greener pastures, but not Helen's family. "This land raised us, and we'll fight to save it," her mother often said with quiet defiance. Looking back, Helen realized how much she had inherited from her parents. Her determination came from her mother, who taught her that women could be just as strong as men. "When life doesn't give you a straight road," her mother would say with a wink, "you pick up a shovel and carve your own path." Her father gave her a deep love for the earth and a belief in the value of honest work. Every blistered hand, every sore muscle, every long day spent under the blazing sun shaped the woman she would become. By the time she turned 18, Helen had blossomed into a young woman with dreams that extended beyond the farm. Yet no matter how much she longed to explore the world outside, her roots on that humble Texan soil were undeniable. "Home isn't just a place, it's the people and the memories that shape you," she often told herself in later years. Though she couldn't have known it back then, the lessons of those early years, perseverance, loyalty, and the beauty of simplicity, would guide her through every twist and turn of the journey that lay ahead. Love and early marriage. Helen first met John on an unseasonably warm spring afternoon in 1947. She was standing in line at the feed store in town, holding a small burlap sack of seeds, waiting to buy supplies for her family's garden. John had just walked in, his sun-kissed skin and strong frame making it clear he'd spent most of his life outside working under the Texas sun. His boots were scuffed, his hat was tilted just so, and his smile, well, it was the kind of smile that could disarm even the most wary heart. Their paths crossed again a week later at the town's church picnic. Helen, despite her natural shyness, found herself charmed by John's easy laugh and kind eyes. They spent the afternoon sitting under a towering pecan tree, talking about everything from the weather to their dreams for the future. John told her about his hopes of one day buying a small plot of land where he could build a life of his own, free from the constraints of working for others. Helen, drawn by his ambition and sincerity, couldn't stop herself from smiling as she imagined a life built on shared dreams. Their courtship was simple, but full of meaning. A few times a month, John would saddle up his horse and ride to Helen's farm, bringing small tokens: a wildflower he'd picked on the way, a freshly sharpened pocket knife for her father, or occasionally a quart of fresh honey from his family's hives. The two would sit on the front porch swing, stealing glances and quiet moments together as Helen's family bustled inside. Their love grew not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet understanding and respect they had for one another. By the time John proposed, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't already guessed they'd end up together. Standing under the same pecan tree where they'd first really talked, John slipped a modest silver band onto Helen's finger and promised her a lifetime of love and partnership. Neither of them had much money, but they had hope, youth, and an unwavering faith in each other. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the backyard of Helen's family farm. The sun was just beginning to set as they exchanged vows, filling the sky with hues of pink and gold. Helen wore a dress sewn by her mother, complete with delicate lace at the hem. John wore his best Sunday suit, borrowed from his older brother since his own was threadbare. There were no extravagant decorations or lavish banquets, just a few tables laden with homemade pies, sweet tea, and fried chicken. The whole community came out to celebrate, and laughter echoed across the fields as neighbors played fiddle tunes and danced well into the night. The early days of their marriage were equal parts challenging and rewarding. With only a few dollars to their name, Helen and John rented a one-room cabin on the outskirts of town. The cabin was drafty in the winter, stifling in the summer, and the well occasionally ran dry, but they called it home. Every morning they ate breakfast at a wobbly wooden table John had carved himself, sharing slices of bread and bowls of black coffee. In the evenings they'd sit on the stoop watching the fireflies dance and dreaming about the life they wanted to build together. John worked any job he could find, from mending fences for neighbors to hauling goods at the local market. Helen meanwhile took on the role of homemaker, managing the small vegetable garden behind their cabin and sewing clothes to help make ends meet. It was, as Helen would later describe, a life stitched together with hard work and love. One particular memory always stood out to Helen. It was a hot, July afternoon, and John had been patching the roof of their cabin, while Helen hung laundry on a line strung between two posts. Out of nowhere, a summer storm rolled in, drenching the landscape in minutes. Helen rushed to gather the clothes, laughing as the rain soaked through her dress. John climbed down from the roof, his shirt sticking to his back, and swept her into his arms. "Looks like the rain won this time," he said, grinning. They danced right there in the mud, letting the rain cascade around them. It wasn't planned, it wasn't practical, but it was a moment that became etched into Helen's soul. A small reminder that even in the face of hard times, joy could always be found. Their love was also tested by the reality of married life. One particularly difficult point came when a brutal drought hit Texas, leaving John out of work and their tiny garden barren. Nights were spent worrying over how to pay for groceries or keep the roof patched. Despite the stress, they made a pact. No matter how tough things got, they'd never let a single meal pass without sitting together, holding hands, and reminding each other that they were in this together. As the years went by, Helen and John's partnership continued to thrive. The hardships they endured only served to deepen their connection. Months of saving pennies eventually led to the day they could afford down payment on a small fixer-upper farm of their own, a place they called their own little piece of heaven. What Helen cherished most about those early years, though, wasn't the milestones or the big decisions. It was the small, quiet moments, the way John hummed softly when he worked, the nights spent sharing stories by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, and the deep, abiding peace of knowing that no matter what life threw at them, they'd always have each other. Starting out in business. The idea came to them one quiet evening after dinner. Helen and John were sitting on the porch of their tiny cabin, the crickets chirping in the background as they sipped their cups of lukewarm black coffee. John had been unusually quiet. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and finally spoke. "Helen, I've been thinking about trying my hand at something new. I want to start a business. A food stand, maybe a burger truck." Helen looked at him, surprised but not entirely shocked. John had always been a dreamer, but this was something more. There was a fire in his eyes, the kind she hadn't seen since their early days together under that old pecan tree. A food truck wasn't an easy decision. They had barely enough savings to scrape by, and putting everything they had into one venture was risky at best. But John was determined. "I can't keep working for someone else forever," he said. "If we're going to build a better future, we need to take that leap. I'll do all the heavy lifting, Helen, but I can't do it without you." Helen couldn't find it in her heart to refuse him. She had always believed in his ability to succeed, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. Together, they pooled what little money they had saved over the years, just enough to buy an old beat-up food truck from another local family who couldn't make it work. To Helen, it looked less like a truck and more like an oversized tin can on wheels, but to John, it was the first step toward a dream. Their first weeks in business were grueling. The truck was parked on a dusty strip by the main road leading into Dallas, surrounded by little more than open fields and the occasional tumbleweed blown in by the wind. Location matters, people had warned them, but this was the only spot they could afford. Helen and John were often up before sunrise, prepping ingredients, chopping onions, and shaping patties by hand. By the time the first rays of dawn broke across the Texas sky, the truck was ready, and the faint aroma of sizzling beef began to waft through the air. But the customers didn't come right away. There were long days when Helen and John sat side by side on the truck's tiny stools, staring out at the empty road. Hours would go by without anyone pulling over. By noon, the sound of flies buzzing around discarded napkins became their only company. "What if this doesn't work?" Helen asked one day, her voice barely above a whisper. John reached over and squeezed her hand. "It will," he said, more for himself than for her. Despite the slow start, they refused to give up. John took on odd jobs on the side to keep the bills paid while Helen figured out ways to stretch their limited resources. She experimented with sauces and seasonings at night, perfecting their recipes by trial and error. One particularly hot day, Helen's homemade spicy barbecue sauce caught the attention of the mailman, who stopped by out of curiosity. "That's the best burger I've ever had," he declared between bites, his words muffled by a mouthful of beef and bread. Word of mouth quickly became their unlikely ally. Within weeks, a trickle of curious locals began turning into a steady stream of customers, drawn in by the smell of fresh-cooked burgers and Helen's signature sauce. Helen would take orders and chat with the customers while John manned the grill, flipping patties with the precision of a craftsman. Still, the work was far from glamorous. The Texas sun beat down on them mercilessly, and the small fan inside the truck did little to combat the stifling heat. Helen's hands were often raw from hours of scrubbing the grill plates and washing dishes, and John came home every night with grease stains that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. There were times, Helen later recalled, when all I wanted to do was throw in the towel. I'd think about how simple life had been on the farm, how much less exhausting it felt to plow a field compared to running the truck, but then I'd see John's face, his determination, and that was enough to keep me going. One memory in particular stood out to her. It was their first truly busy night, the line of customers stretching so far that they couldn't see the end of it. They were running out of food, their hands trembling from exhaustion, but neither of them could stop smiling. As they closed the truck door that night, Helen and John sat on overturned crates, sharing a cold soda they'd found in the back cooler. "We did it," John whispered, and for the first time, Helen believed it too. In the months that followed, their little food truck became a fixture on the outskirts of town. It wasn't just the food that brought people in, it was the warmth and friendliness that Helen and John showed to everyone who stopped by. Farmers heading to market, truck drivers passing through, and even the kids from the nearby high school who saved up their allowances for one of their burgers, all became part of the tapestry of their lives. Looking back, Helen often said that those early days taught her more about resilience than any other time in her life. "We didn't just build a business," she said. "We built something better. We built hope." The hardest times. The hardest times didn't arrive with a crash. They crept in slowly, like storm clouds on a Texas horizon. At first, it was just whispers from neighbors about the economy taking a turn. Business at the food truck slowed. A couple fewer customers here, a missing regular there. Then, one particularly scorching afternoon, Helen and John parked the truck on their usual dusty lot, only to realize it was nearly empty by closing time. Farmers driving by apologized half-heartedly. "Sorry, hard times, you know," they'd say, tipping their hats as they passed by without stopping. Families who once treated their burgers as a weekly treat suddenly couldn't afford even that small luxury. Gas prices spiked and shipping costs for fresh ingredients doubled almost overnight. John ran his fingers through his hair, staring at receipts that didn't add up. "What are we going to do, Helen?" he murmured one night, his voice unusually small. Helen, for her part, had no answers. The pantry at the cabin grew sparse. Eggs and flour, staples they used for everything from breakfast to burger buns, became rationed between their home and the truck. They started skipping meals, choosing instead to keep the truck stocked with food for their customers, even if it meant they'd come home with rumbling stomachs. But it wasn't just the economy that tested them. It was the Texas weather. A heat wave swept through in mid-July, breaking records left and right. The small fan inside the food truck was no match for the oppressive heat. By mid-afternoon each day the truck felt like an oven, and Helen couldn't keep herself from sitting outside on the edge of the steps, letting the open air wash over her face, even if it came with clouds of dust kicked up by passing cars. Then came the mechanical failures. The food truck, already well past its prime when they first bought it, started to give out in pieces like an elderly plow horse. The grill sputtered and refused to heat evenly, burning half the patties while leaving the other half raw. The worn-out wheels blew a tire on the way to Dallas one morning, leaving Helen and John stranded by the roadside with nothing but a jack, a patch kit, and the glaring sun for company. It was Helen who sat down next to John in the dirt after the tire ordeal, dusting off her hands and sighing, a bead of sweat sliding down her temple. "John," she said after a long silence, "I didn't think it was going to be this hard." "I didn't either," he admitted, breaking off a piece of bread they had brought for lunch. He handed it to Helen without taking any for himself. "But you know what my dad used to say? The only way out is through." The drought that hit their cabin was just as merciless as the one swallowing up their business. The garden that Helen had so carefully planted and nurtured began to wither under the unyielding sun, the vegetables turning brittle and brown no matter how much water they used from their dwindling well supply. At night, Helen would sit at the kitchen table after their long shifts, trying to quiet her rattling nerves as John lay asleep in the next room. She could hear his soft, steady breathing and wonder how much longer they could hold on. Despite everything, Helen and John refused to let their spirits break. They found small, almost invisible ways to keep hope alive. Helen got good at stretching ingredients to the very last bite, repurposing leftovers into soups or casseroles to ensure nothing went to waste. John volunteered to clean a neighbor's barn in exchange for a bushel of vegetables, which became their meals for an entire week. The two of them worked tirelessly to keep the truck running, selling fewer burgers and more kindness to the customers who needed it. "I'll tell you one thing," Helen said to John one evening as she patched up a small tear in his shirt, the blue thread wavering slightly in her tired hands. "I've never seen anyone stretch $1 the way we're doing it." "And we're still here," John replied, leaning back in his creaky chair with his arms crossed. "That counts for something." Through it all, the people in their community noticed the way Helen and John carried themselves. They had every reason to complain, to pack it in and give up, but they never did. Helen's determination to keep the truck running brought in those few loyal customers who could still afford to stop by, not just for a burger, but for her warm smile and reassuring presence. "Even if the world's falling apart," one farmer had remarked, "something about having one of Helen's burgers makes you feel like it's not so bad after all." And despite the hurdles, they still found moments of reprieve in their little cabin. On nights when the air cooled down just enough to breathe again, the two of them would sit on the stoop and share a pitcher of ice water, watching the stars glitter above the endless plains. Sometimes John would play a tune on his old harmonica while Helen hummed along, their quiet melodies drifting through the dark like fireflies. One night, after tallying the day's meager earnings, John leaned back in his chair, his voice steady despite the exhaustion on his face. "Helen," he said softly, "one day, we're going to look back at this and be proud. Not because it was easy, but because we held on." Helen reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "As long as I've got you, John, I think I can get through just about anything." And so they did. Day by day, dollar by dollar, they pushed forward. Even in the darkest of times, their belief in each other was the one thing that couldn't be taken away. Success beyond expectations. Helen and John never dreamed their little food truck, parked on a dusty shoulder outside Dallas, would someday be the talk of the town. It had been a gamble from the start, one born out of necessity and carried forward by sheer grit, but the tables began to turn in ways neither of them could have predicted. Word of their burgers spread further than they imagined, first through neighbors and farmers, then through truckers passing through on their long hauls across Texas. The mailman's casual compliment about Helen's special barbecue sauce turned into a chain of personal recommendations. Soon they began noticing new faces pulling up alongside the food truck, each of them curious to see what made their little operation so special. One day a well-dressed man pulled up in a shiny car, the kind that made John instinctively wipe his hands on his pants. The man almost looked out of place, stepping out of the vehicle in polished shoes as clouds of dust swirled around him. Helen greeted him with her usual warm smile, taking his order of a cheeseburger with extra sauce. As he sat down to eat on one of their weathered stools, he took a bite and paused. "This might be the best burger in the whole state of Texas," he announced loudly enough for the few other customers to hear. Helen chuckled politely, used to compliments by now, but she didn't expect what came next. The man introduced himself as a food columnist for a regional newspaper. "I write about places like this," he explained. "Hidden gems. You've got something really special here." True to his word, a glowing article about Helen and John's food truck appeared in the paper 2 weeks later. Helen's barbecue sauce got an honorable mention, described as the magic behind the unforgettable flavor. They hadn't even seen the article themselves before customers started pouring in, asking if this was the famous food truck from the paper. The momentum didn't stop. A radio host passing through featured them in a broadcast, and then a local TV show followed suit, filming Helen and John at work inside their small truck, her hands deftly stacking burgers while John flipped patties with an easy rhythm. "It wasn't just the food," Helen recounted later. "It was the way we connected with people. That's what brought them back." And come back they did. The lines grew longer, stretching beyond what they'd ever prepared for. Helen had to hire 2 young men from town to help with orders while John taught them how to grill with just the right amount of char. The heat in the truck became unbearable on some days, especially during the Texas summer, but neither Helen nor John missed a single day. Their biggest breakthrough came when a local business owner offered them a deal they couldn't refuse, to help them open a permanent restaurant right in town. The man admired their perseverance and saw the potential for something bigger. At first they hesitated. The food truck had brought them so much, both challenges and triumphs. Leaving it behind felt like letting go of a piece of themselves. But the prospect of financial stability and a proper kitchen was too tempting to ignore. With months of planning and cleared savings accounts, Helen's Backyard Grill opened its doors for the first time. The small restaurant was modest, painted in warm, inviting tones with checkered tablecloths on the tables, and John's harmonica hanging on the wall as a nod to their humble beginnings. The menu remained simple: burgers, fries, shakes, and that famous barbecue sauce, but the flavor and hospitality were unmatched. In the coming months, Helen's name became synonymous with quality, home-style cooking. Families came to celebrate birthdays, couples on first dates cozied up in booths, and even weary travelers made a point to stop by for a meal that felt like being welcomed home. Farmers brought fresh produce as gifts, and loyal customers begged Helen to bottle her sauce so they could take a piece of the magic with them. Success didn't mean sitting back for Helen and John, though. They were still the first ones in each morning, prepping ingredients, and the last to leave after closing. "Success," Helen would say, "just gives you more reason to keep working hard." One memory in particular stood out to Helen. It was late on a Friday night and the restaurant was packed. A young girl sat at a corner table with her parents, her eyes lighting up as she took her first bite of a cheeseburger. Helen stopped by their table to ask how everything was, and the girl said, grinning, "This is the best thing I've ever eaten." Her parents laughed, but Helen felt her heart swell. That little girl saw a simple burger as a kind of magic, and it reminded Helen why she and John had worked so hard all these years. Eventually, success changed their lives in little ways. They finally repaired the leaky roof on their old cabin. Helen bought herself a new dress, the first fancy one she'd owned in years. John treated himself to a shiny new grill for the kitchen, but what mattered most was the way they could give back. Helen insisted on hiring locally, giving high school students their first jobs. From sponsoring Little League games to hosting charity dinners, they made sure their success lifted others as well. When asked about the secret to their success, Helen was always modest. "It's not about secrets," she said. "It's about showing up, giving your best, and making people feel like they're family." Looking back on all they'd built, Helen and John often found themselves marveling at how far they'd come. What started as a battered food truck on the side of a dusty road had grown into something beyond their wildest dreams. "We never wanted to be rich," John once said, looking out over the bustling restaurant floor. "We just wanted to make good food and make people happy. I think we did that." And sitting beside him, Helen smiled back. They had done so much more. Managing and raising a family. By the time Helen's backyard grill had nestled its way into the hearts of their community, Helen and John were managing more than just a restaurant. They were managing a growing family. Their 2 children, David and Emily, were the light of their lives, bringing laughter and joy into their once quiet home. But as any parent knows, raising children while running a business was no small feat. Helen often joked that managing the restaurant was like raising a 3rd child, always demanding attention, always needing something, and prone to its fair share of tantrums. But unlike the restaurant, her children couldn't be run on a schedule or fixed with a new coat of paint. Parenting required patience, energy, and a level of love she'd never known before, and she poured herself into it just as she did everything else in her life. From the very beginning, both Helen and John were determined to give David and Emily a childhood filled with love, lessons, and a sense of responsibility. "Our kids might have more opportunities than we did," John once said, "but they'll know the value of hard work." Helen couldn't have agreed more, and the values they shared became the foundation of their approach to parenting. Balancing family and work. One of the greatest challenges Helen faced was balancing the demands of the restaurant with her role as a mother. There were nights when she'd come home long after the kids were tucked in bed, her apron still smelling of grease and smoke from the grill. Guilt weighed heavily on her those nights. She missed reading bedtime stories and hearing about David's new hobby or Emily's adventures at school. But Helen found ways to make it work. On Saturdays, when business would slow during the mid-afternoon, she'd bring the kids to the restaurant. Emily, ever curious, would follow Helen around the kitchen, her little hands reaching for pots and spoons. Meanwhile, David took to shadowing John at the grill, asking endless questions about how the heat worked or what made the perfect burger. Helen smiled at how natural it felt to blend her work life with her family life. "We didn't always get it right," Helen later admitted. "There were times I'd forget an important school event or have to skip a Sunday picnic because the restaurant needed me, but whenever I was there, truly there, I tried to make every minute count." Helen made a point of turning everyday moments into special ones. As David and Emily got older, they became fixtures at the restaurant, helping to fold napkins, sweep the floors, or even refilling ketchup bottles when the lunch rush slowed. John would let David tinker with the old radio in the break room, teaching him how to fix its static-filled channels. Helen baked cookies on Sundays, her one guaranteed day off, and the family would sit on the porch eating warm, gooey treats and sharing stories from the week. A home built on love and sacrifice. Helen and John worked tirelessly to ensure their children had the opportunities they'd always dreamed of. "We're going to send these kids to college, no matter what it takes," John said one night as he and Helen counted up the restaurant's weekly earnings. It became their shared mission, their driving force, to give David and Emily the chance to build lives beyond the small-town limits that had shaped Helen and John's own youth. It wasn't easy. There were lean years when tuition payments loomed over them and every dollar mattered. Helen learned how to stretch a budget like never before. She clipped coupons religiously, patched hand-me-down clothes, and canned fruits and vegetables from their garden to save money. But she never let her kids see the full extent of the worry. "They deserve a bit of magic in their childhood," she said. Despite the sacrifices, Helen and John were always there for the moments that mattered most. They never missed a school recital or a parent-teacher conference. John could often be found in the front row of David's baseball games, hollering encouragement with his arms crossed proudly. Helen was the one making care packages when Emily went off to sleepaway camp, stuffing them with handwritten notes, cookies, and a small book of riddles to make her smile. Teaching tradition and responsibility. As the kids grew older, Helen and John worked hard to instill in them the values that had carried their family forward. They often used the restaurant as a teaching ground, treating it like a classroom of life. Emily, with her knack for creativity, loved decorating the restaurant during the holidays. One Christmas, she spent hours cutting out paper snowflakes, each one delicate and unique, and stringing them across the windows. "It's perfect," Helen said, hugging her tight. Meanwhile, David began taking an interest in the business side of things. At 16, he asked if he could help with the restaurant's books, and John agreed with a smile, though not without a bit of teasing. "Looks like we've got a sharp one here," he joked, ruffling his son's hair. Under his parents' guidance, David began learning firsthand the intricacies of keeping the restaurant running, everything from managing money to talking with suppliers. Helen's biggest hope was that her kids would grow up with a strong sense of family and perseverance. "We didn't build this life without sacrifice," she'd remind them, "but every tough moment is worth it when you're working for something you love and for the people you love." The family's dream takes shape. When David graduated from college, the entire restaurant was filled with celebration. Customers cheered when Helen put up photos of him in his cap and gown outside the register. And when Emily stood on a stage a few years later holding her own diploma, John cried for the first time in years. Those days made Helen and John feel like all the years of effort, the sleepless nights, the endless shifts, the sacrifices, had paid off. They had built something not just for themselves but for their children, who now had a future that had once seemed like an impossible dream. A home full of heart. Looking back, Helen always said her greatest achievement wasn't the booming success of the restaurant or the awards that hung on its walls. It was the simple moments. The laughter around the kitchen table, the pride of watching her children grow, and the unshakable bond of family. "Life will throw challenges your way," she'd tell her children and grandchildren later, "but if you stick together, you can face anything." And when Helen sat on her front porch in her later years with John by her side, both of them watching the Texas sun set over the horizon, she knew she had built something far greater than a business. She had built a family, full of love, resilience, and hope for the generations to come. Family betrayal and turmoil. By the time Helen and John reached their later years, they had built a legacy they were proud of, a thriving restaurant, financial stability, and most importantly, a family filled with love. So when they made the decision to step back from running Helen's Backyard Grill and hand over the reins to their eldest son David, it felt like the natural next chapter. "It's time, John," Helen said one evening as they sat on the porch swing. "We've done our part. Let's give the kids a chance to take this forward." David, who had worked at the restaurant for years, was the obvious choice. He knew the business inside out, and had shown an early aptitude for managing its complexities. His wife Laura was equally involved, friendly, charming, and eager to help modernize the business. At first it seemed like a perfect arrangement. Helen and John felt a deep sense of pride watching their son and his wife step into leadership, bringing fresh energy and ideas to the grill. But all wasn't as it seemed. Little by little, things began to change. Helen noticed it first when her name was no longer being mentioned in community conversations about the restaurant. Patrons would stop her at the grocery store and ask, "Did you know they've completely redone the menu?" Or, "I heard they're thinking about expanding to a second location." Helen's heart sank. She hadn't heard anything about these decisions and began to feel like an outsider in what had once been her life's work. John, ever the optimist, tried to reassure her. "They're just finding their footing, Helen. It's still our family's business. Besides, we wanted them to make it their own, didn't we?" Helen nodded, wanting to believe him, but a nagging sense of unease crept into her heart. Then came the financial discrepancies. One day, Helen received a letter from the bank, a letter that froze her blood. Their personal account, which held years of savings carefully tucked away for retirement, was almost empty. "This has to be some sort of mistake," Helen murmured as she reread the notice. But when they sought answers, the truth was devastating. David and Laura had withdrawn the funds without Helen and John's consent, transferring the money to the restaurant's business account. Worse yet, they had used it as collateral for a loan to purchase expensive equipment and fund renovations that neither Helen nor John had approved. "We had to do it, Mom," David said during a tense family meeting. His voice carried a defensive edge, his arms crossed like a shield. "The restaurant needed upgrades to stay competitive. You wanted us to take over, well, this is part of it." Helen stared at her son, her chest tightening with disbelief and hurt. "But you didn't even ask us, David. That money wasn't just ours, it was your father's blood, sweat, and hard work. We trusted you." John, sitting silently beside her, looked down at his calloused hands, his jaw tightening. "We didn't give you the business to destroy what we built," he finally said, his voice low but filled with an anger Helen had rarely heard in him. David's frustration flared. "You don't get it! Times are different now. We had to act fast to keep up with the competition. I'm trying to save this place, for all of us." But it wasn't just the money. Over the months, Helen and John felt the sting of exclusion as David and Laura steadily began to erase their legacy. Their photographs were removed from the restaurant walls, the recipe for Helen's famous barbecue sauce was replaced with a generic store-bought version, and longtime customers started to complain about the lack of the warmth and community that had always defined Helen's Backyard Grill. The final blow came when David handed them an eviction notice. "We're moving into the cabin," he explained coolly, avoiding his mother's tear-filled eyes. "It's closer to the restaurant, and Laura and I need the space. You and Dad can find somewhere quieter, somewhere easier to manage." Helen was stunned. Her voice trembled as she asked, "You're kicking us out of our home?" "It's just temporary," David said, his tone dismissive. "You'll be better off somewhere else." Somewhere else. Helen's mind swirled as the weight of everything, the betrayal, the loss, the humiliation, pressed down on her. This wasn't just losing a home, a business, or even money. It was the shattering realization that the family they had worked so hard to nurture had turned against them. John, ever her rock, packed up their belongings without a word. Helen watched him, with his shoulders sagged and his movements slower than she had ever seen, as he carefully boxed up decades of memories, including the faded harmonica that had once filled their evenings with music. A new beginning, out of ashes. Devastated but refusing to be broken, Helen and John moved into a small, run-down farmhouse in Colorado, far from the restaurant and the town that had once been the center of their lives. The transition was painful beyond words. Helen would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how she had lost her son, her home, and the dreams she and John had worked so tirelessly to build. John found solace in the quiet routines of farm life, chopping wood, repairing fences, and tending to the chicken coop. Helen, however, struggled to adjust. The betrayal felt like a heavy stone she carried in her chest at all times. Friends from their old town called or sent letters, asking what had happened, but Helen couldn't find the words to explain. Still, as the weeks turned into months, Helen began to find healing in the simplicity of her new surroundings. She spent hours in the garden, her hands in the soil, planting rows of tomatoes and wildflowers. The Colorado sunsets, which painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender, became a daily reminder that beauty could be found even in the wake of heartbreak. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their modest home watching the stars, John turned to Helen and said, "We lost a lot, but we didn't lose each other, that's what matters." Helen nodded, her eyes glistening. "We'll rebuild, John. It won't be what we had, but we'll make something new, together." Life in the countryside. The countryside in Colorado was unlike anything Helen and John had experienced back in Texas. It was quieter, almost eerily so, with long stretches of open land and mountain peaks towering in the distance. After the heartbreak of leaving their home and the betrayal that had rewritten everything they believed about family, Helen and John arrived with little more than their clothes, a few sentimental keepsakes, and each other. Their new home, a small run-down farmhouse on the edge of a little town, was a stark contrast to Helen's backyard grill or their cozy cabin in Texas. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old man. The garden was overgrown with weeds so thick they seemed to claw at the soil, and the fences that bordered the property leaned precariously after years of neglect. To Helen, it didn't feel like much of a fresh start. It felt like they'd been stripped to nothing. But there was one thing the countryside had in abundance: quiet, the kind of quiet that poured over you like a heavy wool blanket. Some days, it was comforting, a reminder that the world wasn't spinning so fast anymore. Other days the quiet was deafening, making Helen acutely aware of the void left by their old life. John, ever the doer, immediately got to work. He spent his days outside fixing up the house in small ways, a loose floorboard here, a leaky faucet there. He built a chicken coop out of scraps he salvaged from an old barn just down the road, gathering enough planks to cobble something functional together. When the chickens arrived, Helen was skeptical. She wasn't sure she could handle the clucking presence of such noisy creatures. But over time, something about their simple rhythms, scratching the earth, laying eggs, soothed her. Helen, on the other hand, found it harder to settle in. The betrayal weighed on her like an anchor to her chest. She tried to rebuild the small vegetable garden behind the house, planting rows of beans, tomatoes, and squash. At first, her hands moved mechanically, almost without hope. But as the weeks passed, she began to find joy in the simple act of nurturing something. Rows of green leaves gradually sprouted through the soil, making her feel alive in a way she hadn't since the day her son handed her the eviction papers. "I guess this garden doesn't mind if I'm broken inside," Helen said one evening, her hands brushed with dirt as she placed a basket of vegetables on the crooked kitchen counter. John looked up from the old chair he was fixing and gave her a small smile. "Broken or not, Helen, you've still got a way of bringing life back one way or another, always have." The rhythm of rural life was slow but steady. Their days were built around small routines, tending to the chickens in the morning, walking down the dirt road to the tiny general store in the afternoons, and watching the sunset from the porch steps in the evening. Those sunsets, those incredible, sprawling Colorado skies that lit up with purples, golds, and burnt oranges every evening, became Helen's favorite part of the day. "You ever notice how quiet the sunsets are here?" she said one evening, leaning back in her chair as the horizon seemed to glow. Back in Texas there was always noise, people talking, cars driving by, neighbors yelling from their porches. But here, it's like the whole world just stops to watch. "Maybe that's because you finally have time to hear it," John replied as he handed her a cup of tea. Those quiet moments became a balm for them both, a reminder that life could still be beautiful even after it had broken their hearts. Finding peace in the little things. As time passed, Helen began to see the countryside in a different light. It wasn't just a place to start fresh, it was a place where they could strip away the expectations, the roles they had played for so long, and simply be. She struck up conversations with their neighbors, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for baking pies, a young couple raising goats who always seemed to have a spare jar of fresh milk. Slowly, the isolation she had feared began to fade as people started welcoming them into the fold with warm smiles and open hands. Some of the best days came when Helen and John worked together on small projects around the property. They weren't building anything grand, just fixing windows, repairing fences, and planting small rows of wildflowers along the porch. But there was something healing about the simplicity of those tasks. They'd laugh over the chicken that refused to stay in its coop or cheer when a wild rabbit dared to step close enough to the garden without taking a bite. One day, while trimming the weeds that had grown along the edges of the property, John stopped in the middle of his work. He wiped his brow, leaned on the handle of his tool and said, "You know, Helen, I thought I'd hate it here. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life wishing we'd stayed in Texas. But there's something about this place. It gives you room to breathe, doesn't it?" Helen leaned on the fence beside him, gazing at the distant mountains. "Yeah," she said softly, "it does." Coming to terms with the past. While the days were peaceful, Helen still found the nights difficult. When the house was quiet and the laughter of neighbors had faded, the memories of their betrayal would come rushing back. She'd lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying conversations in her head, wondering where things had gone wrong, but slowly, she realized that holding on to those thoughts wasn't doing her or John any good. She began journaling, pouring out her feelings onto the pages of a small notebook. The act of writing helped her put things into perspective. One quiet morning, sitting on the porch with John, Helen said, "Maybe this is what life wanted for us. I don't know why it happened the way it did, but here feels honest. Like we're closer to who we were before all the success and heartbreak." John nodded, placing a hand over hers. "We're still standing," he said. "That's gotta mean something. A simpler yet fuller life." As the seasons changed, so did Helen and John. They stopped measuring life in accomplishments or mistakes, and started valuing the small victories, the taste of fresh eggs from their chickens, the sight of flowers blooming in their garden, the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass. Life in the countryside didn't heal them completely, but it gave them the space to rediscover themselves and each other. For Helen, the pain of betrayal never fully disappeared, but it slowly softened, becoming less of a wound and more of a faded scar. She realized that the success they'd built in Texas wasn't truly lost because the values that had fueled it, hard work, kindness, resilience, were still alive in her and John's hearts. One evening as they sat on the porch drinking their tea and watching the sun dip below the mountains, Helen smiled. "We'll never have what we used to," she said, "but maybe we have something better now. Something simpler, something real." John reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I think you're right," he said. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Helen truly believed it. The final peaceful days. The golden years of Helen's life were far removed from the chaos and turmoil of the past. Now residing with Lily and her young family, she had finally found the kind of peace that felt like 1,000 tiny miracles stitched together. Every day was a gift, simple and filled with the kind of grace she had spent her life striving for. Lily and her family adored having Helen around. The mornings often started with the sound of laughter echoing through their home as the grandkids scrambled into Helen's room, pleading for one of her famous stories. "Grandma," her youngest great-granddaughter would say, crawling into her lap, "tell us about the food truck again." Helen would chuckle, her frail hands brushing loose strands of hair from the child's face. "The food truck, huh? Well, Did I ever tell you about the first time the mailman tried my barbecue sauce and declared it magic? The children would listen with wide eyes as Helen spun her tales, stories of triumph and heartbreak, of resilience and rebuilding, of family and forgiveness. She never skipped over the difficult parts of her journey. "Life wasn't always kind to us, kids," she would say, her voice trembling slightly, "but that's why you've got to keep your heart open. Hard roads test your spirit, but they can lead you to where you're truly meant to be. Simple pleasures in a full life." For Helen, the days now unfolded in slow, steady rhythms. She would occasionally sit on the porch in Lily's backyard, a quilt draped over her legs, watching the world buzz around her. The sight of Lily hanging laundry on the line or the sound of her great-grandchildren racing across the yard with sticks, pretending they were explorers, brought a contentment that couldn't be measured in words. Though her body had become weaker with age, Helen's mind remained sharp. She spent hours knitting blankets for the children or flipping through old family photo albums, her fingers brushing over the faces of loved ones frozen in time. One afternoon, while flipping through a particularly dusty album, Helen came upon a picture she hadn't seen in decades. The old food truck parked on a dusty road, with John and herself standing proudly in front. She held the picture up to the light, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Grandma, is that you?" her grandson Luke asked, peering over her shoulder. "It sure is, sweetheart. Your grandpa and I worked every day in that little truck. We whipped up the best burgers in Texas, or so we like to think," she said with a laugh. Luke furrowed his brow. "Was it hard?" Helen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, it was very hard. We didn't have much, so we worked with what we had, but we loved it, and we loved each other. That made all the difference." Her days were filled with small joys that carried enormous meaning. Baking cookies with Lily's children, teaching her teenage grandson how to make biscuits from scratch, or sitting by the fireplace while John's harmonica, a keepsake from their earlier years, rested on the mantel. These weren't grand events, but they were the moments Helen treasured most. Reflections on a life well lived. In her quieter moments, Helen loved to sit by the window with a cup of tea and reflect on all she had lived through. She thought of her parents back on the Texas farm, the struggles of Dust Bowl years, and the laughter of simpler times chasing fireflies in fields. She'd smile, remembering how her father told her, "Hard work builds character," though she now believed fatherly advice left out the importance of laughter and love along the way. And then John. Helen thought of him often, of his strength during their darkest days, and the way his determination carried them forward when hers faltered. Even after his passing, his presence still filled her heart. "You'd be so proud of us, John," she'd whisper softly to no one in particular when the nights grew still and quiet. "We built something beautiful, even when the world tried to take it away." Of course, her thoughts often lingered on David, Laura, and the path their family had traveled. The pain of betrayal had long since softened, replaced by gratitude for their eventual reconciliation. She now cherished the dinners they shared as a family and the way David checked in on her regularly, always with a sheepish grin that reminded her of the boy he used to be. "People aren't perfect," Helen would tell Lily one evening as they sat rocking on the porch. "They'll disappoint you, sometimes in ways you'd never expect. But if you give them the chance, they'll often surprise you with how much they grow. If I hadn't forgiven, I wouldn't have the family I have today." Passing down wisdom. As her final years grew shorter, Helen became even more determined to leave a legacy of lessons for her family. She wrote letters to her grandchildren, each one brimming with stories and advice drawn from her life. "Never underestimate the strength inside you," one letter read. "You might not feel brave, but you are. Don't let failure stop you. It's just a stepping stone to something better." She also made sure to share her recipes. One rainy afternoon, Helen and Lily spent hours in the kitchen, Helen's hands guiding her granddaughters as they recreated her famous barbecue sauce. "A little more vinegar, but not too much," Helen instructed. "And now a touch of honey. The key is balance, just like in life." Lily smiled as she jotted notes in a well-worn cookbook, cherishing every word. "Grandma, you know we'll pass this down to every generation, right?" "That's the idea," Helen replied, her eyes twinkling. A peaceful goodbye. Helen's final days were quiet but filled with love. One cool autumn morning, as the leaves near the house began to turn golden and the air carried the faint smell of pine, Helen sat on the porch wrapped in one of her handmade quilts. The children were at school, and Lily sat beside her, reading aloud from a book Helen had always loved as a young girl. Helen's breathing grew slower, her face calm and serene as she gazed out at the horizon. "You know, Lily," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, This is all I ever wanted, to leave the world knowing I was loved and that I loved just as deeply in return. It hasn't been a perfect life, but it's been a good one." Lily squeezed her hand, her own tears falling freely. "You've done more than enough, Grandma. You've shown us all how to live and love." Helen smiled, closing her eyes and letting out a contented sigh. In that moment, surrounded by everything she held dear, Helen's heart was full, her journey complete. Valuable lessons from life. By the end of her long, eventful life, Helen had become more than just a loving matriarch for her family. She had become the keeper of wisdom, a source of strength, and the voice of hard-earned truths. Her journey from the dusty fields of Texas to the quiet countryside of Colorado, with all of its peaks and valleys, had left her with lessons she felt compelled to share. "A life worth living," Helen often said, "isn't about the trophies on your shelf. It's about the love in your heart, the people you reach, and the strength you find when life brings you to your knees." Helen had a saying for nearly every moment, words of advice that stemmed from the many chapters of her life. Whether she was sitting by the fire with her great-grandchildren or sharing quiet conversations with Lily on the back porch, Helen took every chance she could to pass those lessons on. The value of hard work and determination. "Hard work builds character," Helen would say, repeating the mantra her father had drilled into her all those years ago on the farm. "A person's worth isn't measured by how well they do when life is easy. It's measured by how they show up when life feels impossible." Helen often recounted stories from her girlhood, the long, callous, blistering days spent under the unforgiving Texan sun, harvesting crops alongside her father. "We didn't have much," she said, "but what we did have we earned with our own two hands. And there's a kind of pride that comes with that, a pride no amount of money can buy." When her great-grandchildren complained about chores or homework, she would smile knowingly and say, "You ain't seen hard work until you've had to wrangle a stubborn mule at sunrise, but the work you put in today will make tomorrow better, and you'll be stronger for it." Resilience in the face of heartbreak. Perhaps Helen's greatest lesson, though, came from her ability to endure life's most difficult trials. "The world isn't always kind," she told her family. "It'll knock you down, sometimes so hard you'll think you'll never get back up, but, trust me, there's always a way forward, even if it's not the one you pictured." Helen's resilience was forged in moments of loss, whether it was her family's struggles during the Dust Bowl, the betrayal she endured when her son turned against her, or the heartbreaking day she buried John after years of partnership and love. Yet, through it all, she refused to let bitterness harden her heart. "I used to think holding on to anger would help me feel strong," she admitted to Lily one afternoon. "But here's the truth, darling. Anger only weakens you. It eats away at your joy. If I hadn't learned to let go of the pain David caused, I'd still be stuck, living in a past I could never change." The power of forgiveness and love. Helen was living proof that forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's mistakes. It was about choosing your own peace over pain. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she explained to her grandson Luke as they sat by the fire one winter evening. "It means you're strong enough to put the past where it belongs, so you can move forward with an open heart." For years her family witnessed the strength of her forgiveness in action, especially when she reconciled with David and Laura. She didn't dwell on the betrayal that had once destroyed their family. Instead, she focused on rebuilding what had been broken. "It's the love you give, not the mistakes you make, that people will remember," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "I never stopped loving your dad, no matter what he did." That love is what got us all here, back together again. The beauty in simple things. Helen also believed deeply in the beauty of simplicity, a value often lost in the hustle of life. "Life's not about chasing big shiny things," she told Lily's children one afternoon while they baked cookies together. "Somewhere along the way, people got the idea that success means having the fanciest house or the biggest bank account. But take it from me, a loaf of bread, warm from the oven, can bring more joy to a family table than a whole feast in a cold, empty mansion." Helen's greatest joys often stemmed from ordinary moments. Whether it was watching her husband play the harmonica under a Texas moon, planting tomatoes in the garden, or watching her great-grandchildren chase fireflies in Colorado, she found happiness in the smallest blessings. "Don't wait for the big moments," she warned her family, "because life is made up of the little ones, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss them." Second chances and new beginnings. Another lesson Helen emphasized throughout her life was the importance of second chances, not just for others, but for yourself. "We all mess up," she said one day while showing her granddaughter how to knead dough. Mistakes are part of being human. What matters isn't the mistake, it's what you do next. Helen spoke from experience, having rebuilt her life several times over. After leaving her childhood farm, she built a modest home with John, only to later face the trials of losing their restaurant, their savings, and, for a while, their son. "You can start over as many times as you need to," she told Lily once, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "There's no shame in falling, only in refusing to stand back up." A legacy of kindness. Perhaps the most enduring lesson Helen left, though, was the power of kindness. "People won't always remember what you say or do," she said, quoting a line from a book she had loved in her youth, "but they'll never forget how you made them feel." Helen's life was a testament to those words, from the kindness she extended to struggling neighbors back in Texas to the warmth she offered her restaurant customers. Helen believed that compassion was the glue that held communities and families together. Even in her later years, when her strength began to fade, she found ways to inspire kindness in others. "You don't need money to be kind," she'd tell her family. "All it takes is a smile, a helping hand, or a little patience when the world feels rushed. Those small things add up to something greater than you could ever imagine." Passing down the wisdom. In her final months, Helen worked tirelessly to ensure her lessons would live on. She penned letters to every member of her family, filled with reflections on life, love, and courage. Each letter ended with the same hope. "Carry these lessons with you, just as I carried the lessons of those who came before me. This world is far from perfect, but I believe in the good within it, and within you." She also left behind her recipes, journals, and quilts, gifts that held pieces of her heart. To her, these items weren't just keepsakes, they were bridges to her legacy. "Live with a full heart. Live with a full heart," Helen told her family during one of her final conversations. "Love deeply, forgive freely, and never let the hard days make you forget that the good ones are worth fighting for." These words stayed with them for generations, a reminder that while Helen's life had come to an end, the lessons she left behind would continue to guide them. A message to remember. In the final days of Helen's life, as twilight settled gently over the tapestry of her years, she felt an unshakable need to leave behind something timeless, not money, not possessions, but words. Simple, heartfelt words that would carry on when she no longer could. Sitting quietly on the porch of Lily's home, her frail hands wrapped in a soft quilt, Helen looked out at the golden horizon and began to form the message she so longed to share. Life, she thought to herself, was never about the grand victories or the trophies on the mantle. It was about the moments that added up to something bigger, the love that persisted through hardships, the resilience that carried you when all seemed lost, and the forgiveness that mended even the deepest wounds. Helen knew this truth better than anyone, and it was this truth she hoped to pass on. "Someday they'll need to hear my voice," Helen often whispered to herself, not out of vanity but from a deep understanding of how life could shift and twist in unexpected ways. "These words may guide them when my arms can no longer hold them." And so, as the days grew quieter and the nights cooler, she began crafting her letter, a letter not just for her children and grandchildren, but for anyone searching for solace, wisdom, or a sense of direction. "To my beloved family, when you read this, I won't be here anymore. Not in the way I've always been. But don't cry too much for me, because I've lived a life that I wouldn't trade for anything. It hasn't been perfect, but nothing is, and that's the beauty of it. Perfection is overrated anyway. Life is about the imperfections, the times you thought you'd fall apart but didn't, and the moments of pure joy that remind you why you keep going. I want you to carry a few things with you as you walk your own paths. These lessons weren't handed to me. They were carved into my heart, one trial and triumph at a time. First, love deeply. There is no such thing as loving someone too much. Pour your heart into your family, your friends, and the people who cross your path. Yes, love might hurt sometimes, it's true, but it's the only force I've ever known that makes the pain worth it. Love doesn't turn away during hard times, it leans in, it fights, and it forgives. Second, forgive freely. I know better than most that forgiveness isn't easy. When David betrayed your grandpa and me, it felt like my world had shattered, but holding on to that pain would have only hurt me more. The minute I let go of my anger, I found freedom. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did, it's about choosing not to let their actions define your future. Third, don't fear failure. Oh, how I wish someone had told me this earlier in life. Failure isn't the end, it's the beginning of something new. Think about our little food truck, how it struggled at first or how we lost so much later on. Those moments felt like endings, but they brought us to something greater. You only fail when you stop trying. Fourth, cherish the small things. The world will try to convince you that the big things, money, success, fame, are what matter most. Don't let it trick you. The real treasures are in the laughter around a dinner table, the feel of dirt between your fingers in the garden, and the sound of crickets on a summer night. Happiness hides in small things, waiting for you to notice. Fifth, be kind. Kindness is your strongest weapon against a world that can be harsh and unforgiving. Hold doors open, say thank you, and always look for the good in people, even when it's hard to find. A little kindness has a way of rippling out farther than you'd ever imagine. Sixth, find beauty even in hardship. There will be times when your heart is heavy with grief or fear, and it will feel like there's no way forward. In those moments, take a breath. Look for something, a sunset, a child's smile, the smell of rain hitting the earth, and remember, beauty surrounds us even in life's hardest seasons. Finally, know this, you are enough. As you are with all your flaws and strengths, your doubts and dreams, you are enough. Don't spend your time trying to be anyone but yourself. The world doesn't need another somebody else, it needs you with all your unique gifts and quirks. I hope you'll carry these lessons with you the way I've carried every single one of you in my heart. Know that I've loved you in ways words can't quite capture, beyond what I ever thought possible. And even as I leave this world, that love isn't ending, it will be with you every day in ways both big and small. When you look to the sky and see the stars, I hope you'll think of me. And when you face challenges that feel insurmountable, I hope you'll remember that you come from a long line of strong, stubborn, and resilient people. If I could do it, so can you. So go on, live boldly, love fiercely, and never forget to laugh more often than you cry. Life is waiting for you, and it's beautiful if you're paying attention. With all my love, Grandma Helen, leaving a legacy of love. On the day Helen quietly passed away, Lily found the letter folded neatly on the bedside table. Sitting down beside her grandmother's still form, she read every word through tears, feeling both the loss and the overwhelming presence of Helen's love. The letter became a family treasure, read at birthdays, funerals, and even on quiet days when hope was needed most. Helen's words turned into a compass for generations of her family, guiding them through both storms and sunlit days. She left us more than memories, Lily once said as she read the letter aloud to her children. She left us a map, and it always points home. In the end, Helen's greatest gift wasn't the food truck, the restaurant, or even the famous barbecue sauce. It was her wisdom, woven with love and born of a life lived fully, and though she was no longer there to say it in person, her message remained clear to anyone who read her words. Live a life that matters, not because of what you own, but because of how you love. The freedom to hold on to happiness. The house was quiet as the morning light filtered through the lace curtains hanging in the kitchen. Elizabeth moved calmly around the room, preparing her tea the way she had done almost every morning for decades. She set the kettle to boil and leaned against the counter for a moment, taking in the familiar details of her home that she had come to appreciate even more in recent months. The worn wooden floorboards that creaked under her feet, the scratched but sturdy kitchen table James had refinished by hand, the faint aroma of lavender from the dried flowers she kept on the windowsill. This house was her sanctuary, her history. There was a knock on the door. Elizabeth smiled to herself. It was Michael. She knew it even before she opened the door. Her son had a knack for arriving unannounced, but always at just the right moment. "Michael," she said warmly as she opened the door. "What a nice surprise. Come in, come in." "Morning, Mom," Michael greeted, stepping inside with 2 paper coffee cups in hand. "I stopped by the cafe downtown. Thought you might like a chai latte for a change." Elizabeth chuckled as she accepted the cup. "You're spoiling me," she teased, though her tone was filled with affection. Michael followed her into the kitchen where they both took seats at the table. For a few moments they simply enjoyed their drinks, the quiet punctuated only by the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. "There's something different about you today," Michael finally said, breaking the silence. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Different? What do you mean?" Michael shrugged, a small smile on his face. "You seem lighter, happier maybe, like you found some kind of balance." Elizabeth gazed at her son, thoughtfully. She had been reflecting a lot lately, about her life in this house, about the decisions she'd made to stand her ground, and about the different kinds of happiness people fought for. "Michael," she began slowly, her voice carrying both wisdom and calm, "do you know what I've learned over the past few months?" Michael leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "What's that?" Elizabeth took a sip of her chai latte, savoring the flavor before responding. That happiness isn't always about chasing something new or exciting. Sometimes it's about holding on to what you already have. It's about recognizing what truly matters and making the choice to protect it, even if that choice isn't what others expect. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You mean the house?" he said softly. Elizabeth smiled. "Yes, the house, but also more than that. I've realized that this home isn't just where I live, it's where I feel connected to everything and everyone I love. It's where I feel free to be myself, where I can wake up each morning and know I'm living the life I want. I didn't fight to stay because I'm stubborn or because I'm afraid of change. I fought because this is where my happiness lives." Michael looked down at his coffee cup, turning it over slowly in his hands. "I think I get it now," he said after a pause. "I've been so focused on trying to change things, for me, for Becky, for the kids, that I didn't stop to think that maybe happiness doesn't have to come from starting over. It can come from holding on to what gives you joy, even if it's not flashy or new." Elizabeth reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her touch filled with warmth and reassurance. "You have your own journey, Michael, and your own way of finding happiness. But for me, it's always been right here. Every flower in that garden has a story. Every corner of this house holds a memory. And I'm not afraid to say that those quiet joys mean more to me than anything else ever could." Michael met her gaze, his eyes soft with understanding. "I'm glad you stayed, Mom," he said quietly. I think we needed to see that standing still sometimes takes more courage than moving forward." Elizabeth gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "And I needed to see that it's okay to hold your ground, even when it feels like the world is pulling at you to move. Happiness isn't about pleasing everyone else. It's about being true to yourself." The conversation turned lighter as the two of them finished their drinks, laughing over stories of the grandkids and sharing updates about life in Michael's busy household. But before Michael left that morning, he paused at the door, turning back to look at his mother with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, Mom," he said simply. Elizabeth tilted her head, smiling warmly. "For what, sweetheart?" "For knowing who you are," he replied. "And for showing me that it's okay to fight for what makes you happy." Elizabeth gave a small laugh, patting his arm. "Oh, Michael, life's too short not to. Always remember that." As the door closed behind him and his footsteps faded down the driveway, Elizabeth stood for a moment, her hand resting on the old wooden frame. What Michael had said echoed in her mind. "Thank you for knowing who you are." She smiled softly to herself, her heart full. This was her life. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was hers, filled with the small, quiet joys that made each day meaningful. Later that afternoon she returned to her garden, where the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the colorful blooms. She knelt in the dirt, her hands brushing against the soil as she tended to her roses. It wasn't just a garden to her, it was a living memory, a reflection of the love and care she and James had poured into every part of their lives together. As she worked, the world around her felt still, peaceful. This was what Elizabeth had chosen, a life built on the foundations of love, independence, and the freedom to hold on to happiness in a way that was uniquely hers. No matter what challenges came her way, she knew one thing for sure. She would never stop fighting for the life that had brought her so much joy. After all, happiness wasn't something to be chased. It was something to be cherished, protected, and held close, like the petals of a fragile flower blooming in the morning light. And for Elizabeth, that was more than enough.